and welcome to the Art Business Podcast. I'm David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director of the MA in Art Business at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. And today I'm delighted to welcome Judith Nugée. Judith is one of the United Kingdom's foremost antiquities specialists. After studying classics at Oxford and working with the renowned Beazley Archive, probably more about that later, she spent 24 years at Christie's, ultimately becoming head of antiquities, before co-founding specialist advisory firm Hornsby plus Nugée. Alongside advising private collectors, museums and institutions, Judith has worked on the valuation of some of Britain's most significant archaeological discoveries, including the Staffordshire Hoard and the Galloway Hoard. Judith has also lectured for many years now at Sotheby's Institute and recently delivered a fascinating lecture we have electives, and I deliver an elective with my colleague Barbara Lassett, who's an old master specialist. We have an elective called Cross-Collecting and Display, the Market for Antiquities and Old Masters. So she has recently lectured on that course. And she talks about the realities of the antiquities market, and the students absolutely adore it. So Judith, welcome.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very honoured to be here.
And I'd like to use today's conversation slightly differently from my normal podcast. Rather than simply talking through your remarkable career, if I might say, I'd like to explore what the antiquities market can teach us about the wider art business, because I'm aware that a lot of our listeners just don't really know about this market. You know, it's a niche market, as you know. It's the turnover is minute compared to the other sectors in the art market, for reasons that we're going, for fairly obvious reasons. Because in many ways, antiquities raise some of the biggest questions in our field. How do we establish value? That's what we mainly talk to our students about. And that's cultural value and financial value and their relationships. What is expertise? You know, what do we mean by connoisseurship these days with AI coming in now and technology and chemistry and so on, dendrochronology? Who owns culture? Why does provenance matter? And what responsibilities, I think this is the really important thing, what responsibilities come with collecting? So to start with, we'll talk about what makes antiquities different. Many of our listeners work in contemporary art, galleries, museums, auction houses, or advisory businesses. So what immediately surprises people when they encounter the antiquities market for the first time, Judith?
I think it's just the sheer age of some of the things that we're dealing with. So we go back, over 5,000 years to sometimes the 6th millennium BC, the 5th millennium, more commonly the 4th, the 3rd, 2nd, 1st millennium BC. So we're talking thousands and thousands of years, and that really freaks people out sometimes. It's also the history, the thought that, Roman emperor could have owned this, or perhaps Roman slave had it round his neck, and you're thinking about the people of these ancient civilizations, and it's the object that actually has almost a visceral connection when you hold it in your hand. And there's also the variety, because you can be dealing on the one hand with a tiny little piece of jewelry or a little arrowhead, and then on the other hand you're dealing with monumental sculpture, so and sort of all sorts of materials. So you've got things like jewelry, glass, precious metals, stone. So it's just the enormous variety, I think, is also really astonishing to people. I think the other thing is that they can actually acquire something with this age and history, sometimes for not very much money. And that's another illuminating sort of factor that hits people when they look at the antiquities market for the first time.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, really, isn't it? Because people always say to me, I can't believe that. And what fascinates them is that I could own something that is that old for much less money than something that was painted last year. That's Absolutely. What I get a lot,
Ancient jewelry, for example. Ancient jewelry, if you were to go to a fine jeweler to buy a beautiful gold bracelet, you'd be paying many thousands of pounds, and actually you might pick up something from ancient Rome or Egypt for a similar or even a lesser price, gold earrings, for example.
So, we've seen a recent, you know this, we've seen a recent tendency of at least one antiquity dealer I know in London who has this wonderful that they will find a gem or a cameo, an ancient
Yeah,
cameo, and like really nothing new. They used to do this in the Renaissance. They'd mount it in a ring that you can wear, maybe in a
yeah,
new mount or a necklace.
yeah, exactly.
It's wonderful, and it just looks, the way it's displayed, it just looks like contemporary jewelry. And then you look at it
Mm,
again, and they say, "Oh,
yeah,
this is actually 2,000 years old." Wow,
yeah.
So one thing that strikes me from your lectures is that antiquities don't really fit neatly into conventional market models. There are no living artists, very often. Most of the time, we can't even put a name on these artists, but we might talk about things like Greek vases later, which sometimes do have names, and obviously that has an effect on value. There's no kind of catalogue raisonnées in the contemporary sense, no production studios, sometimes, as I've said, no identified maker at all. So how does that fundamentally change the way that value is constructed, where we have this fetish, particularly in the Western world, for putting a name, an artist's or workshop's name to something?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's a very different exercise, and although in certain categories like Greek vases, for example, you get many things of a similar type, really almost every object is unique. And we don't have these nice catalogue raisonnées of a particular person's work, so it is a little bit harder. Often you're presented with an object which is very unusual. Sometimes it's unique. It has no it has no parallels at all. Sometimes and whether that be from archaeological excavations or on the market. So you just have to really think outside the box a bit. And of course, experience does help. The more you've handled the material and the more you handle similar material, then you can form a picture in your mind, and you can understand what it is that makes an object acquire commercial value, what is going to appeal to today's market. And so, it's a bit like being a barrister and making a case for something. So you will draw on your experience, you will draw on previous auction records, for example, and your knowledge of the market, and you'll say, okay, well, there's nothing that's quite exactly like this Anglo-Saxon gold, whatever, but in neighboring mainland Europe, we've got things of a similar age that are making this sort of price. So you just construct a case and you form a picture. It's a bit like a mosaic, and you get all these different elements, and then you gradually arrive at what you think is the right value. And if you've given it some thought, it usually works out quite well.
Yeah,
Because
so a lot of it about comparables to a certain extent.
Yes, because actually, when you're looking at what we do within what the commercial market calls the antiquities, the field of antiquities, you're dealing with thousands of years, you're dealing with a huge geographical area, and you're dealing with lots and lots of different cultures. So although you may say this object, okay, it's Celtic and it comes from Gaul or France or whatever, but at the same, and it's this sort of size and shape and made of gold. We did sell a wonderful Greek pair of earrings or a Roman pair of earrings. So they're not the same, but they're of similar quality. They have that same market commercial appeal, aesthetic. They're well made or they're not well made. They're beautiful. They're not beautiful. They're finely worked. They're crude. They're damaged. Condition is terribly, terribly important. Makes a huge difference to commercial value. And again, that depends on the material. Strangely, Greek vases, by Greek vase tutor, Professor Kurtz, used to say, short of actually taking a hammer to a Greek vase and then grinding the shards under your foot in powder, they're indestructible. So, you can piece them together, and it is very normal to have Greek vases that are put together from pieces. Whereas glass, which is much, much finer material, much, much more fragile, as soon as glass is cracked or damaged or has a piece missing, that affects its value terribly. So it's knowing all these strange idiosyncrasies which is quite helpful.
It's very interesting when something, as you say, some of these objects are really unusual. I'm thinking actually of what I believe is still the world record for an antiquity, which is Mesopotamian, the Gwen Old
When on
Lion. And they just didn't know how to value that. I seem to remember, and
yeah,
it was a wonderful to see what was going to happen at the auction, and in the end, it did remarkably well. My students are always amazed when I say, "It's by the way," I show a slide and it's huge. I say, "By the
yeah.
way, it's that size,"
It was a
and
remarkable object and a complete one-off.
yeah,
So there was
very
much,
very old or
yeah,
comparatively old compared to
Yes.
Greco-Roman objects. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and interesting. I'm just thinking of a parallel. So yesterday I was looking at there's a Christie's Sold Master sale coming up either tonight or tomorrow in London. And one of the works is this Lawrence, the famous portraitist, his portrait of Wellington. And that sold at Christie's. I was looking in when the market was arguably, when, the economy was buoyant, etc. 2006. I think it was estimated at Christie's London for it sold for 2 million, but it was estimated for much less than that, and so it went beyond its estimate. And now it's come up for sale again, and because it sold for 2 million then partly, but they've estimated it much higher, like 8 to 10 million, I think it is. It's really weird, and you're always trying to work out why is that. Do the Christie's specialists know something that there are several collectors that are going to be bidding against one another, or do they just think for other reasons that it's not inflation? you know?
No, it's not inflation. I mean, I can't comment on that because it's completely
Yeah,
out of my
yeah, yeah,
field. So I'm going to. But so first of all, putting estimates in catalogues is something particular. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that you won't know about, and the estimate can be at its level for any number of reasons.
yeah,
Tends to be that estimates are, well, particularly in the antiquities field, you're trying to put an encouraging estimate to start
yeah,
people. But if you actually put an estimate sometimes at the level that you think it's going to sell for, it discourages people from bidding and they don't bid. It's really bizarre. It's very odd psychology. But again, with something that's sold previously, sometimes you can base your future estimate, if it's sold 10 years, 20 years later, on that. But so much may have changed in the interim. So I don't know what their reasons are for increasing the value, but I'm sure they've got a good, there'll be a good reason for it.
mm, yeah,
And that's why it's actually sometimes difficult to go on the estimate itself. You have to go and speak to the specialists and get a feel. Sometimes, the estimate is there, but they will say to you, actually, this is going to go for a lot more. So sometimes that may be because they know there's a lot of interest. They can't say
yeah.
how much interest, but they say there's been a lot of interest. And if you want a good chance of getting it, you really have to be thinking of a higher figure. And that's what we do as advisors the whole time when we're helping people. And we say, well, we don't know why that's been estimated so low, but it's a fabulous piece. And you're really going to have to think 5 times the estimate if you want a chance of getting it, which is a bit disconcerting. Or other times you just say, no, stay within the estimate. That's a good price for it. And don't go higher.
Yeah, and the other thing which is similar to your field, Judith, is sometimes an object will come up and you'll say, this should be in a museum. And I wonder about I wonder whether there are certain museums that might be interested in that portrait. Who knows?
Maybe. We'll
uh,
see.
but 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 I'm sure that we will talk about a couple of objects later, which are definitely kind of what we call museum quality. What I was going to ask you next is, we talk about with the old master market in particular, but also to a certain extent with antiquities, the role of connoisseurship. You've already talked about, you use your experience, you see an object, you look at comparables, but you also begin to develop a feel that you can only really develop over a period of years of handling and looking at these objects and, think having discussions with collectors, what is the fashion at the moment. So we got this thing called connoisseurship, which many people see as a very subjective thing. But we also hear a great deal today about data analytics, price databases, AI becoming involved. So do you think that expertise could ever be fully replaced by, say, AI?
I mean, in my opinion, no. I deal with what Christie's we used to call bulky art, not flat art. Flat art was the pictures. We were the bulky art, but particularly with I don't know about pictures. I'm sure it's the same. You have to examine the thing in the flesh. You absolutely have to. It's very difficult to explain everything that you get from handling an object. With antiquities, sometimes it's just the weight. You can have a pot in your hand. You pick it up, a Greek pot, Corinthian pot, whatever, or it could be a piece of gold jewelry. If the weight is wrong, straight away, that gives the object away. You think, is this actually? The weight is really, really important. The surface, the feel, the touch. and then just seeing the object in the flesh, no photographs can replicate really what the object looks like. And the other thing is scale. I know you may have measurements in a photograph and so on. You may have the measurements, but nothing beats actually seeing it, because then you can really picture, you can see its visual impact so much more accurately than in a photograph. So that's one thing, is handling things. But then the more you handle, of course, the more you get a feel for things, and the more you understand, the more you can get a gut feeling as to whether an object is fake or not. That's terribly important in the antiquities market, as with so many other fields in the art market. There's an enormous amount of faking, obviously. Restoration, even repair. These things are important. And when you say connoisseurship, it's not, I don't know exactly how you're using that term, but I would say it's an experience in your field, but it's also knowledge about the object. So I would say having an academic background does help. You have a sort of historical skeleton onto which to fix these objects, to place them in time, to place them in their cultures. And I think nothing can replace that. Absolutely nothing. You can read as much as you like. I mean, you get sort of, for example, the difference between academics who are studying a subject but don't really handle the objects, and those who do handle the objects, who really, they're not just looking at all of this scholarship on paper, but they actually take an interest in handling the objects and handling a wide variety. And it's only then that they are then able to spot what is an anomaly, what is unusual, why is it unusual? Does that mean it might be fake? Or is it, no, absolutely original? It must be of that period, but I've never seen anything like it. It's that sort of ability to differentiate. Actually, there's the case of a valuation I did just recently. The object was originally found, and it was declared as treasure. And I think it was during COVID, so the object wasn't seen in the flesh. They were going from photographs, and it was deemed to be not Anglo-Saxon, but much later. Just they didn't understand what it was. And that was astonishing, extraordinary, because actually it's a masterpiece of Anglo-Saxon gold work. But it's only if you've handled stuff, you've been exposed to the oddities, that you think there is room for this. I've seen so many weird and wonderful things that are absolutely ancient. This doesn't fit into any category, but there's no way this is not ancient. This is absolutely Anglo-Saxon. So I'd say, the handling, the knowledge, it's you can't replace that.
Yeah, I would agree. I would definitely agree with that. And I'm trying to look at this as objectively as possible,
Yes.
rather than being in the trade, as they say. But maybe you should just a
I'd
couple
also,
of things. Go on.
I'd also say with the introduction of AI now, which is helping people, which is helping scholarship, it's obviously an incredibly powerful tool. But you need to spot where it's hallucinating. If you know your subject, if you know what you're looking for, you can then spot the errors. If you don't know what you're looking for, you may come up with this wonderful case study or this marvelous paper that is completely fictional, and base your argument on that. So if you have a base knowledge of what you're doing, then you can spot, and then it can be a very helpful tool.
Yeah, I think we could say with, next year we're thinking about how we present AI to. Remember, our students are doing art business, so they're going to go into jobs which are expecting, the big auction houses already expecting an understanding of
Yeah.
AI as a personal assistant. So it's teaching people, you've got to already have your knowledge. You've got to have your art historical knowledge. Otherwise, you won't begin to sense when AI is hallucinating. I think
Yeah,
that's very important.
yeah. And actually also check the sources, obviously. When it comes up with something,
Oh
always
God,
check the
it's
source.
terrible at sources. It really does. I've seen this. It makes amazing things up, and that's sometimes how we realise that a student is kind of, cheating. I've never seen. I didn't realise they wrote this. So that but it will undoubtedly have a part to play, and it'd be fascinating. I think Judith. I always think that's it now. There's never going to be any new technological developments, and then the next kid on the block, this time it's AI, comes along. I'm sure that you've experienced that with new
Yes,
technology.
indeed.
There's always something new. And I was just going to explain to the listeners that we haven't really defined what we mean by antiquities. And Well, Judith and I would say, are from a classics tradition, whereby we've been brought up in a kind of, I'm going to use the air quotes here for people listening. We've been brought up in a Western-centered world, so we have a tradition that Antiquities is like basically objects from antiquity, from the pre-medieval world, if you like, the Greco-Roman world, Mesopotamian, the ancient Egyptian world, around the Mediterranean, basically. But I'm very aware also that, I've got a lot of Chinese and Southeast Asian students, Latin American students, Global South students. Antiquities will mean a different thing to them. But so I'm just defining our parameters there. This is very much about these Western antiquities, and at some point I might do a podcast with more about, say, Chinese antiquities.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Western, as in the ancient world that came into contact with the Western world. So explorers, armies, expeditions that were going as far as Egypt, Mesopotamia, but not really. Then Chinese and China, Japan, Korea, all of that. That's sort of like a separate category. So yes, they are ancient. Yes, they're antiquities, but it's not what we define. That they used to be defined as Oriental antiquities. I'm not sure that term's any longer acceptable, but it's just a different field of study from the one that you've outlined, really.
Yeah, I've got a new colleague on our program who has also worked at Christie's in their Chinese Antiquities department for several years and works at SOAS. Luckily we've now got her time, at least temporarily, Dr. Ivy Chan, and she, it's fascinating going around even a Venetian palace, and there's always some Ming vase or that I'm just totally ignorant of, and she will say,
Yes.
there were a lot of these, it's not particularly valuable. And then suddenly her eyes are open and say, wow, these were Renaissance collectors in Venice, obviously with the Silk Route coming through their contacts with the East, and we're going to see, I think, a lot more. I think we're going to see increasing fusions of what it means to study antiquities, maybe in the future. But yeah, I just thought we'd better define that parameter and put our hands up, as it were. You often describe antiquities as objects that sit simultaneously between art, history, and archaeology. So do those different identities create different forms of value? Because obviously people in contemporary art world, they're not thinking about archaeology and not so much about history, but they're thinking about art and contemporary culture. How do those things change the ways we value? And I don't just mean financial value, but cultural value.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting question, because of course a lot of things that were made in antiquity were not made as art objects to sit on the shelf. They had purpose, they had function. It was very often, they were not so much everyday items. They would have been functional: vases, tableware, pottery, jewelry. But when you had offerings to be placed in temples, to be placed in the home, the fact that they were made of fine materials and to the highest artistic quality was really the maker's skill, the maker's art was being put into the object to the glory of whatever gods they were worshipping. So they still had a purpose and a function. It wasn't just a lovely object to be put on your windowsill. They all had meaning. They all had, for example, fine silver tableware for a Roman, some Roman aristocrat. Much the same as today, he's displaying his wealth by having his beautiful silver on his sideboard, as you would today going into somebody's home. They might have their collection of whatever it is, or their fine china and so on. But the point is, they all have a very particular purpose. His silverware is his dining ware, and these things have different commercial value attaches in a different way. So some things are incredibly rare historically or archaeologically. Some things combine historic rare value, the value that attaches to a rare object, a very unusual object, but also are made of a stunning material and have massive universal aesthetic appeal. And then that changes the value. So, for example, you might have, two Roman heads. They're of similar date, similar archaeological importance, but one happens to have that sort of extraordinary and almost undefinable wow factor, the sort of quality that makes somebody passing by just look round and say, wow, that's amazing, because the stare is there, or there's something about it that attracts somebody's eye regardless of what they know about the object, and that will really change the value, I think, quite significantly. But it's sometimes, things are incredibly historically important or very ancient. Doesn't mean to say they have high value at all. Not at all. So people are astonished sometimes when you have something that's incredibly rare and incredibly old, and yet it's not worth very much because not very many people want it. It's going to be very desirable to a museum. It might be very desirable to a specialist collector, but it doesn't have a wide market. So you're not going to have lots of people in competition, and therefore the price is going to stay relatively contained. So you have to weigh up all of those different factors when you're trying to value something, put a fair value on something.
Yeah,
And it is true that actually, in terms of presenting objects to museums for acquisition, particularly if they're high value objects, increasingly now, which I think is quite a shame, people will say, or museum will say, it just doesn't have enough of a wow factor. We can't spend, hundreds of thousands or even a million on an object which isn't going to draw the crowds immediately. And if it has some sort of an aesthetic punch, that's really going to help it. If it doesn't, if it's much harder to understand, it's going to be much, much harder for them to spend serious money on it.
Yeah, that always surprises people who are used to this model that we are taught in universities, really, that, museums are not about money and commercial value, but unfortunately they are. Their budgets go down and down. And you're quite right that they now have to increasingly think, I need to put on an exhibition maybe this year, and I'm in a museum outside of, we're hearing this in our politics at the moment, the decentralization that might be coming. A museum in Manchester, they can't, if you like, gamble in the way that maybe a London gallery can with a new contemporary artist that no one's really heard of. So they get the money because of the footfall into the exhibition. So it has to be Tracy Emin. It can't be someone that no one's heard of. So you get that. I think that's what's going on in those museums as well. You're quite right. So they have to think
if it's gold and blingy, well,
yeah, gold in the ancient world. Yeah, exactly. So just moving on now to provenance, which is possibly these days the most important word, like certainly on our program, because it covers not just things about learning about commercial value and cultural value, but obviously ethical and legal issues about where something's come from. So if I ask my students for one word they now associate with Judith Nugée, I suspect many would say provenance. So why has provenance become such a defining issue in the art market, and from your viewpoint as an antiquities specialist as well?
Well, for antiquities, it's become really important, mostly because many of these things are from countries that no longer allow the export of their cultural goods. And we're trying to be really careful to guard against handling, buying, advising people to acquire things that have been illegally excavated and illegally exported. And obviously that's a pitfall with antiquities. The thing that people don't understand is that antiquities have been around and collected for a very long time. So you do have things, you have many, particularly classical antiquities, that are going back to 16th, 17th centuries. So they've been knocking around for centuries already. So there is an awful lot of stuff out there that can be absolutely legally acquired and traded and so on and owned. The trouble is, we weren't so obsessed with all of this until really much more recently. So the countries of origin, whether it's Greece, Italy, Egypt, the countries that now make up what's Mesopotamia, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and so on, they've all brought in legislation at different periods, different times. But now, almost all of those countries, some will allow an export license, Israel, for example. But most of them, it's impossible to take antiquities out of the country. So we have to be really careful about where objects have come from. And until relatively recently, people weren't really talking very much about that. In an academic environment, yes, we were always talking about that. So both my predecessor, Christine, who took me on at Christie's in 1985, she was an Egyptologist and she'd worked in the field. She was an archaeologist. She'd taught at university. I'd just come out of university. We were very aware of the context of antiquities and the whole, you know, the whole sort of history of looting and smuggling, but also legal acquisition. So we were it mattered to us. But when I joined Christie's in the mid-80s, you know, it was considered a waste of ink and space in the catalogue to put, to use up a line of text to put where something had come from. Nobody was asking the question, where has this come from? Museums were buying pieces in the 80s without really, they might have asked, but, they didn't really dig into provenance. And as a result, had come a cropper later on. It's just something that wasn't really on the discussion board until later. I mean, if you look at the Parthenon marbles, even no one really was creating a stink about those until the actress Melina Mercouri, who's acting, and then she turned to politics in the late 60s, and she made that her sort of, I think, her platform to make her political career. She started talking about repatriation of the Parthenon marbles, but no one was sort of asking for them back before then. So now it's become a hot potato. But it's archaeology and antiquities, they sort of follow politics, don't you? People use them, have always used them for their political ends, for whatever they want to, for the message that they want to create. So they've been a bit of a football. And so we really care about provenance today because there's increasing awareness of history of looting and smuggling and so on. So we want to differentiate between those objects that have been legally and legitimately exported from their countries, legally and legitimately acquired by collectors down centuries, I might say, and to try and help educate people to buy things from trusted sources that have history rather than risking buying things that have just been smuggled out of a country of origin.
Yeah,
so,
and
very important.
yeah, and I mean, we could talk forever about this, but just for the listeners who aren't aware of this, I put this into one of the reasons, arguably, why this has only really started becoming important was UNESCO's rules. They're meeting in 1970, and in the 1970s they start bringing in these suggested guidelines, not laws. They can't make the laws for different nations. Different nations are signing up to these aspirational regulations, as it were, on sourcing antiquities, and so listeners can just look at the UNESCO website to learn more about that. But I agree with you, Judith. I mean, another big provenance issue is, of course, Nazi looted art. I honestly remember in the 90s, again, no one really cared that much about it. And it's really in the new millennium that these things have become much more
very much so.
Yeah.
I think, in Christie's and Sotheby's, for example, adopted a sort of arbitrary date of 2000 as a break-off point. They wouldn't have, in the early 2000s, they started saying, we're not going to accept anything that doesn't have a provenance dating to pre-2000.
Yes.
And why did they choose that date? It was because of the US Customs. And US Customs had introduced that date, and it was such a nightmare and a headache for them. They thought, trying to get things to the States, they just thought, I tell you what, let's just use 2000 as a cut-off date. So you were in the ridiculous position of buying something from Christie's in, say, 2001 or 2002, before that had actually all been decided, which doesn't have a provenance written in the catalogue. You try and sell it in 2010, and they say, well, no, because we don't have a pre-2000 provenance. You say, well, hold on, I bought it from you in 2002. So, I think everyone has to adapt to taking a pragmatic approach and understanding sometimes that, well, I'm sure we'll come on to this, but that objects have lost provenance. They may still be legitimate, but they've lost provenance, and then that becomes a real difficulty. But we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah, and I just also to explain, UNESCO, interestingly, wasn't decided it couldn't be retroactive. So it was basically suggesting that anything from now, i.e. then, at that point, the early 1970s, needs paperwork and evidence that it came out of its source nation before 1970. And I've been with my students at like art fairs like TFAF in Maastricht, the very important one for Antiquities dealers as well. And an Antiquities dealer, I remember he had this Corinthian helmet, and he was showing it to the students, allowing them to kind of handle it. You know, you were talking about the importance of handling. And then I said, has there been interest from museums? Because it's a really good example. I know some museums need a Corinthian helmet and they don't have one. You know, everyone has to have a bronze helmet. And he said, yeah, several, but then they've asked for the paperwork because I can't prove, I have nothing to prove it pre 1970 paperwork. They can't acquire it. So he said, the person who's likely to buy this is a restaurateur who's going to kind of, apparently they've got some kind of Greek themed restaurant and it's going to be in their restaurant. And he said to my students, what is more ethical, that I sell it to this restaurateur or to a museum in, you know? And then there's this big problem about archaeologists saying, no, you can't encourage, you know, they've got to draw the line somewhere, museums, or you'll be encouraging illegal archaeology. And that brings me on to the next thing, Judith, that I think you spoke earlier, you used the word that it was considered treasure, this Anglo-Saxon object. Maybe you could explain to the listeners the portable antiquities schemes, which is particularly relevant in where we are in the United Kingdom, because I think that really changed the idea of metal detectors and what you do with the objects when you find them. Maybe you could explain that to people. What is
Yeah,
treasure?
I mean, the portable antiquities scheme was formed. I've forgotten the exact date, but it's been it's been in use for over 20 years now, and it was an enlightened scheme to try and bridge the gap between the metal detectorists who are finding the objects and the sort of the academic community, the archaeologists, because there was quite a lot of bad feeling between both. There's the old sort of adage that the metal detectorist doesn't care about the context; he just wants the object, and the archaeologist just wants the pothole. He doesn't care about the object; he wants the archaeological content. But when I first joined Christie's, there was a lot of animosity, but there was this amazing guy in Norfolk who was really bridging the gap and trying to encourage metal detectorists to come to him to show them what they had found. And you know, diplomacy and dialogue is so important in our field, to get people talking rather than putting up barriers and thinking that they're the evil ones. You know, there are two camps and never the twain shall mix. People going to a museum to declare their find, and the museum sort of trying to diddle them and trying to say, oh, you know, this isn't Roman. There was an amazing Romano bronze stag actually that came to Christie's, and they'd taken it to the local museum, declared it wasn't treasure because it was made of bronze, not precious metal. And the museum had first of all claimed that it wasn't ancient, and so they'd give them just a couple of £100. The finders brought it to Christie's. We said, this is an amazing Romano-British treasure, beautiful bronze stag. And at the time, this is millions of years ago, we'd given an estimate of £5,000 to £8,000. So they went back to the museum and said, Christie says it's worth £5,000 to £8,000. What would you like us to do? And the museum said, oh, okay, it is Romano-British then, all right. But it's still not worth that. And we'll give you £300. So metal detectors had really done as much as they could. They ended up putting it in a sale at Christie's where it made tons more, and the export license got stopped. And then the original museum, who had been offered the piece for a fair price, had to raise 10 times the amount to match what it actually sold for. And that's all because of sort of suspicion and them not wanting to deal fairly with the detectorists. So as a result, then the detectorists feel they're not going to be treated fairly by museums. They're going to try and palm us off and give us a value that's not a commercial value and all of this. So the portable antiquities scheme was put in place to try and bridge this gap, to bring people together, to make them work together, to use this great resource of all these finders who are finding extraordinary finds, whether they're commercially not very important things, little bronze bits and pieces, and they encourage them to then declare their finds to a finds liaison officer so that they could be recorded and entered on a national database. So you have an archaeological picture of finds being built of not Britain, it's really England.
Yes.
More than Wales and Scotland have a slightly different way of operating. But it's an absolutely extraordinary resource for archaeologists who would never have the time and resources to go and, dig, survey all this extraordinary geographical area. And it was to make the metal detectors feel valued, to come forward, to have their objects identified so that they took an interest, and also that they were given an incentive to declare important finds. So what we call treasure. Treasure, various definitions of treasure, objects that have a minimum of 10% precious metal, or things that are, a hoard, buried as a hoard, or prehistoric. I mean, there's various sort of criteria. And if it's deemed to be treasure, it is then supposed to be, technically it's property of the crown. But what it means in practical terms is that you can't keep it. It is declared. A coroner declares whether it's treasure or not. If it is treasure, it goes for identification at the British Museum and further research and so on. And if an acquiring museum would like to acquire the thing, it then gets a commercial valuation. This is where I come in, and others like me. We will then spend some time trying to give a commercial, what we think is a fair commercial valuation to the object. With our valuations, those all go to the Treasure Valuations Committee, who sit and look at our valuations, and we say, yes, this is a fair valuation for this object. That goes back to the landowner and the finder. At this point, if they're happy with that valuation, the museum that wants to acquire it can then acquire it, and the landowner or finder are compensated, if you like, with the commercial value. So, sorry, that's probably a bit confusing, but if I found an object, I take it, it goes to the Treasure Valuations Committee, I'm told it's worth £50,000. I am then, the museum wants to buy it, they've got the money, I get £50,000 tax-free. I've not paid anyone for a valuation. I've not paid a commission to any auction house or any dealer. I get that in my pocket tax-free. It's good incentive to declare your finds, because of course it's still the case that a lot of archaeology is finds are sometimes traded on the black market. They're not declared. But the introduction of the portable antiquity scheme has meant that a lot of lists of that sort of happens. It still happens, of course, but you really have this incentive to declare your finds. So sometimes it's not about the monetary value. It's about contributing to this wonderful archaeological database, to this picture of Britain, to our better understanding of our own history. And so it's really, I think, been revolutionary in terms of, and of course it has increased metal detecting. Some people think it's a bad thing. It's it's a arguable thing, but I would look on the bright side and say, as a result of metal detecting, the most astonishing finds have been found, which transform our understanding of history. And the responsible ones, as soon as they've found something which they suspect is more than just a single find, it's a hoard or significant remains, they get in touch with the finds liaison officer or the local archaeological unit. They will sometimes sleep on site and guard what they've found before excavating, to make sure that, because sometimes the word comes around and then the nighthawks come and it's looted.
Yes.
They will actually guard the site. And then the archaeologists come in and then take over the archaeological excavation. Without that initial find from the metal detectorist, that would have lain there and we would be none the wiser. And some of these finds, as I said, are transforming our understanding of our history.
Yeah, and listeners might be, Judith used the term nighthawks there, which is basically the kind of nickname that we give to people who aren't just metal detecting because they're interested in the past. And they now know that if, as Judith says, if they find something which is treasure, they will get the fair value for it. And if the museum doesn't want it, they can keep it, as I understand it. But I'm just thinking that people listening can't just go out with a metal detector and they know where a Roman villa site is.
No.
That is likely to be, any important archaeological site or any archaeological site, as I understand it, tends to be protected, and it's illegal to do that unless you're a professional archaeologist. So a lot of these finds, as I understand it, Judith, are found when ploughed fields, when the farmer ploughs the field. And many of those objects, the argument was, they're gonna just get damaged and they're gonna rust anyway. So
They're going to
why
get
not
rust,
encourage?
damage.
Yeah,
Exactly. And also, quite a lot of them also found on construction sites,
Yes.
developments. So then they come
London.
across absolutely amazing finds. But I was going to say also, if you are a metal detectorist, you always have to ask for permission from the
Permission from the
landowner.
landowner. Yeah.
And it tends to be that whatever money arises at the end of it is split equally between the two parties. They have their own arrangement, but that is terribly important.
Yeah.
But I was also going to say, coming up at Christie's at the moment, it's on view today, is a very rare Anglo-Saxon pendant. It's gold pendant. They've catalogued it as an estel. It's not an estel. It's not a manuscript pointer, but it's that's an example of something that was found that's been through the treasure process, and then it's what's called disclaimed when it's given back to the owner and the finder. Now, is that because any acquiring museum couldn't find the money? And that does happen increasingly as more of these remarkable finds surface. And sometimes the valuation is such that the museum that had the interest was hoping it might be around a certain figure, but then the valuation comes back and they can't. I did a valuation for the extraordinary Rydale hoard, and that was so that could be sold because it was made of bronze. There was no precious metal, and it was an extraordinary assemblage. And York Museum asked me to do a valuation, and I thought, oh no, I just know that they're going to be very surprised by what I put on this, and so I valued it. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was something like 180,000, and I know that they weren't expecting that. And sure enough, they couldn't acquire it. It went for sale, and it sold for almost exactly what I said it would sell for, minus the commission. Fortunately, it has found its way to York Museum, but which is really wonderful. But it's just really hard when the museum can't afford.
Yeah.
And then if no one can acquire it, none of the museums or institutions, it goes back, and then you can do what you like with it. You can keep it, you can sell it, as with this Anglo-Saxon gold piece at Christie's. So it's a very enlightened, I think, and a fair system, which is, I think, frankly, other countries think about, because there's so much. Who needs 5 million broken Roman fibulae worth about 15p? No one needs all of that.
It's never going to be displayed. They're just sitting in boxes in the British Museum or a local museum then.
Absolutely. Gathering dust somewhere and not being... And so if there are people who are interested in buying them for 15p or 20p, well, why not? As long as it's all declared, and if it's done in a fair manner. Anyway.
But as you say, although, like with that example, once these metal detectorists are saying where they found the piece, and they can use GPS now, it goes into this database, and then archaeologists can use that data. I remember one of the most important things that happened. I looked it up, by the way. I cheated. It's 1997. The Portable Antiquities Act came.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
And I know in the early millennium, I read this amazing archaeological piece that was using the database, and they worked out there were Viking objects, and they worked out a new theory of the Viking invasion, and it was coming down through areas of England at the time which they never realised that they were there.
Oh, absolutely.
So that was an example that wouldn't have happened without the Portable Antiquities scheme. So it's certainly all the time. So there's a lot of research there for then PhD students to look at who are interested in, and maybe we just also better say to the listeners that obviously what the problem with an illegal excavation is you lose the whole historical context. So even something that is of no value, maybe a sherd of a Roman terracotta lamp, which on the market you can buy, a few £100, if that. You can get these because there's so many of them. It's supply and demand. But what is most important to an archaeologist is where that lamp was found, because it can give you a date for the layer of, say, a Roman mosaic, a Roman villa building, and so on. I think that's why archaeologists want to deter any kind of illegal excavation. But as I said, a lot of this material, as I understand it, is in ploughed fields.
It's in topsoil.
The topsoil. They're not digging down into that and damaging the archaeology. So you've already said something about it belongs to the crown, theoretically, like in this country, if treasure, like with the precious metal, is found. And then I guess the British Museum is part of that public ownership structure, which is feed which is dripping down, as it were, from the notion that the royal family ultimately owns this material. So the next thing that we could discuss is who owns the past. So one of the reasons antiquities attract public attention is that they raise difficult ethical questions. You've spoken about the Parthenon marbles, for example. Who owns those? Is it Athens and Greece, or is it the British Museum and the British people? So, how has the conversation around collecting changed during your career, Judith? And to a certain extent, you've already spoken about that. So maybe I could ask another question. When you entered the field in the 1980s, what conversations weren't happening that are central today? And maybe how should we think about the balance between private collecting and public stewardship? You've spoken also about museums can't afford these. So what is that relationship between the private collectors who will buy an antiquity, very often which a museum can't afford, and the public museum and us, the public, who would like to see this material? Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's the conversations that weren't happening then that are happening now are very much around provenance. I mean, really, the first question you ask now is, oh, what's the provenance? Do you have any paperwork? Do you have any? And that wasn't being done at the time. Christine and I were slightly anomalous in that because we had come from these backgrounds, we were interested in the provenance. We'd always ask the history of a piece, but we weren't necessarily asking for proof, for written proof, and so on. So that's a big change. The thing about stewardship and private and public collections, I think voices have got more vociferous. I think there's always been a bit of a debate about whether things should be in private collections or not. My great mentor at Oxford was Professor Sir John Boardman, who's sadly now died. But he was always a remarkably measured voice in this debate. He hated hypocrisy, and so do I. And I don't like people who stand up and mouth off against people who are private collectors and so on. At the same time, they're very happy to accept their hospitality or whatever it is. I think collectors, really important to recognise that private collectors have always played a major role in the whole history of collecting art and of museums. I mean, it was private collectors who funded the first great national museums. We can't forget that. Where would we be without all their collections that we enjoy today? I think private collectors, what they can do now is if they're not treated as the enemy, if there's again dialogue, if there's appreciation each side of the other, they can be the most enormous force for good. I mean, for example, the Rydale hoard, well, they found a particular person to stump up the money to acquire it for the museum. I mean, how wonderful is that? They would have lost it otherwise. Private collectors can put their own things on display or loan things, but they often come forward and find the funds to acquire something which is, for example, at auction. So museums usually take a very long time to amass funding, and the auction will just come and go, and they won't have had the time to get the funding. So sometimes a private collector will either fund the object or buy the object with a view to being reimbursed afterwards. But I think they're terribly, terribly important. And then again, without people who are collecting, who are taking an interest, who are grabbed by a particular subject, where do you get the philanthropists and the benefactors of the future? The young lad who's suddenly discovered that he can buy a Roman coin at auction for very little money, and he'll put his pocket money and buy it. He's the one who becomes obsessive and then goes to the museum and looks further into it, and then starts a conversation with the curator, and then the curator, they start a relationship, and then later on perhaps he'll become a patron of the department or something. I think this is terribly, terribly important. You really can't have one without the other. I believe, and I do believe it's possible to collect responsibly and legally. And I really, because there is so much I'm talking about my field because I can't generalize, but in my own field, there are so many antiquities that have been legally traded for centuries, for hundreds of years. And I think we will always be able to collect responsibly. Obviously, the pool of really important things shrinks as the very important things because things that are major things that are found now are either belong to the country of origin, they cannot be sold, or as in our country, the likelihood is that if it's very important, it will be saved for the nation, it will be acquired by a museum. So the pool is shrinking, but nevertheless, I think there's still plenty out there to encourage new people to come and collect responsibly, as well as existing collectors.
No, absolutely. And I have noticed that some of the art fairs, like TFAF, for example, they have a lot of educational videos which are being seen by the dealers and the collectors at the museum. So they are trying to encourage, for example, we haven't really spoken about it, but restoration. We have a museum approach to restoration now of say a broken ancient Greek vase, where the new ethics is that you mustn't deceive the public so you used to just fill in the missing bits, and now they don't do that anymore. They have perhaps a piece of neutral clay so that you can see that's modern. And I've noticed that increasingly that Antiquities dealers are saying, actually, we're beginning to get collectors who don't really want us to restore the vase. We get some that do, and it's up to them. It's they're free to have it restored, even though a museum might say, "Oh no, that's unethical the way you've done that." So, but I am beginning to see maybe collectors quite interested in not restoring the object. And after all, collectors don't want they want a broken torso of a beautiful male nude or a Venus. They don't mind that because it looks, whereas in the Renaissance, of course, they wanted it to look pristine.
Then make them all up. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And now everyone actually quite likes the idea of the broken arms and the headless torso. It has a different kind of beauty. But yeah, often with vases, I understand that they want it to look pristine. So there's all sorts of changing educational aspects of the way we collect and view these objects.
Very much so.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I think sorry, people who have historic collections, for example. I mean, again, they do take advice and so on, which is great, because you don't. Well, the last thing you want with, for example, a country house collection of magnificent classical marble sculpture, the last thing you want is over cleaning, which was a fashion, back in the sort of 80s and 90s, to over clean things, and that's a bit that's not a good thing. But so
absolutely. So I'm aware at the time. So I think we covered a lot of what I was planning to talk about already. So maybe to finish by thinking about future generations, Judith, we're very art historians in general are very aware that art history is being taught less and less in schools. You and I know that classics has suffered a lot. So classical studies was invented. It was an amazing invention, I think, to cope with the fact that no one had the time in schools to learn the original languages of Latin and Greek, for example, or Mesopotamian or Egyptian hieroglyphs. So they moved to classical studies in translation, and that I think has encouraged younger people or people going into education to have a knowledge about the ancient world. We've seen incredible increase in interest, particularly in the Roman world, with Tom Holland's books and, Mary Beard's more easy to read, discussions of Pompeii and sites like that. There's been a popularization of the subject to a certain extent. But maybe, there may be people listening to this who are thinking about entering this world of antiquities and maybe, ending up doing what you're doing. So what qualities do you think young professionals need most today in order maybe to end up going into an antiquities auction department or becoming a freelance specialist in valuation like yourself and Sarah?
I think you really have to be deeply passionate about the subject, because it's a difficult field to get into, and unless you're absolutely bitten by the subject, it's going to be too tough. If it's just a passing interest or, oh, this might be a nice idea, forget it, because it's going to be a difficult path, I'm afraid to say. So you really, really want it. That's one thing. And then I'd say flexibility, because it's very often the case that there just isn't an entry into exactly the space you want. So be flexible, be prepared to take a job you weren't quite expecting, perhaps in a slightly different field, or with not in the auction house or with the dealer that you were hoping for. But just be flexible, have a start, and quite often it's the case that if you persist, you'll end up in the place that you wanted. But it is difficult because now we have international applicants for all spaces, all jobs. It's much harder, I think, than in my day. And you have a lot of very overqualified people hunting down very few positions. So you have to be realistic about that. I would also say talk to as many people as you can. I'd say talk to people in the industry. Then you find out that there are different jobs. Some people end up going going into, for example, art law or something that's a bit tangential, or provenance research, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say, do some homework, see who the professionals are operating out there, and just ask. You can always ask. You don't. You might be turned down, but ask to have a few words and ask about their experience and get a feel for it, because it's not an easy world. You're not going to make tons of money unless you're a very, very successful dealer. I'm not a dealer, but yeah, just get yourself informed and be prepared to be flexible, I would say.
It's the same. Honestly, your answer is the same. Anyone I ask on these podcasts, they're saying the same things. Networking is, and having the confidence to just go and chat. But the enthusiasm's got to come from yourself, and that means reading and going to museums, getting really interested, as you say, in the subject. So Judith, what strikes me after this conversation is that Antiquities, I think, force us to ask some of the most fundamental questions in the art world. What gives an object value? How do we establish authenticity? What responsibilities accompany ownership? How do we preserve cultural history for a cultural heritage and history for future generations? So I'd like to thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great pleasure, David. Thank you very much.